Alright, I have basically decided today to record a video on how to read your astrology chart. Astrology is really interesting, mainly because it takes all of these personality traits and divides them into characters in the form of signs. It divides them into planets. Those are the characters themselves. It divides them into areas of life where you express those characters, and those would be the houses. And it also tells you under which circumstances certain combinations of characteristics are supposed to come out. And that would be the angles right here, the aspects. Those are the four levels of an astrology chart. You've got the signs around here, you've got the planets around here, you've got the houses around here, and you've got all these aspects in the middle. This can be really informative when you're just trying to learn about yourself or learn how you do things, or you ask what your fate is. Astrology won't tell you about fate, but it will tell you some things that you are inclined to do which are easier than other things that you're inclined to do. In this video, I'm only going to talk about the planets. They can get pretty involved, but over the course of the next couple of videos, I'll describe all four levels of an astrology chart so that you can actually learn how to read it. Now, before we proceed, I need to mention that what an astrology chart basically is a snapshot of the sky when you were born. And so if you see in the background here, you've got this ASC. This ASC is called the Ascendant, and it's basically the eastern horizon. At sunrise, the sun comes up, and it would be right here in the sky. Later in the day, as the sun gets to its highest point, it moves up to this place called the Midheaven. And it's also known as the Imum Coeli, which is why it's the MC. And then the sun, as it dips below the horizon, here's sunset right around here, it will fall below the western horizon, and that's called the DSC. I'll talk about those when I describe houses, because these divisions of the sky are basically the houses. Now, this particular chart in the background shows the sun down here. That's that little dot there with that circle around it is the sun. And so this tells you that this individual was born at night because the sun is beneath the western horizon. Okay, all of the planets basically have meanings, so let's go ahead and talk about them. Now, this chart is a little bit more crowded than some of the ones you may be familiar with, because when I'm reading a chart, I read a lot of things besides the basic planets. I also tend to read planets related to ambition, and that's kind of my area of specialty as someone who studies astrology. Everybody's different, so I like to read planets about ambition and about love as well. And so in addition to basic planets, you also have a lot of love, quote, asteroids, and a lot of asteroids related to things that you want to accomplish in the world. By the way, throughout this video, I'm going to mix the word planet and asteroids and bodies together because it gets a little complicated referring to what these things actually are. So, for example, Uranus, indicated by this glyph here. A glyph is just a symbol. This symbol here is for the planet Uranus. That's an actual planet, and we can see that it's up here in the 8th house, and it's in Eris. So that will tell you something about Uranus. More on that when we get to the houses and we get to the signs. But the point is that Uranus is an actual planet. Ceres, on the other hand, is not an actual planet. It's a dwarf planet. You could call it an asteroid, but when we actually classify these things and we line up with the way NASA talks about them, a lot of these things can't be considered planets or asteroids. They would just be called bodies. I know that for people who are sticklers, so just bear with me. I'm going to be a little bit sloppy with the terminology, and you'll sometimes hear me talk about Ceres as being a planet or an asteroid, but it's really technically neither. It's a dwarf planet, much like our old friend Pluto. I know everybody knows that Pluto got demoted. It used to be a classical planet, and now it's considered a dwarf planet, just like Ceres, and that has to do with its orbit and its gravitation and all kinds of other things, like clearing out its orbit of other bodies. Now, also in this chart, you'll see things that don't really exist at all, except for being mathematical points. So, for example, the North Node. The North Node talks about your destiny, but really it's one of the focal points of the moon's orbit around the sun. It is a mathematical point. It is not a thing in the sky, technically, but I'm going to call it a planet anyway. You've got the part of fortune. The part of fortune is something called an Arabic part. It has to do with your being in your element, your space of contentment. But again, it's a mathematical point. It's not a thing in the sky. And then you've got other stuff. So, yeah, let's go ahead and talk about the meaning of these things. So, what you have are a bunch of basic major planets. I know, moon's not a planet, sun's not a planet. I keep going over that because if people are watching this video and they're saying, astrology, who cares? That's not even a planet. Yeah, no, it's just jargon, so don't worry about it. But the sun is really the main planet that we look at when you're trying to study astrology and you're really new to it. So when you're new to it, you'll hear people say, "Oh, what are you? What's your sign?" And when they ask what your sign is, they're basically asking what your sun sign is. The reason the sun is so popular is because the sun talks about your one-to-one interactions, so we can more or less observe what you're doing and what you're about from afar. So somebody who has a sun in Gemini, for example, is going to tend to be more outgoing and more sociable than some of the other signs by comparison, all things being equal. Now, the misleading thing about sun signs is that your one-to-one basic interaction, or your ego, is not the only thing that you bring to the table. If you think about it, you don't just have a way of engaging other people, you also have a way of feeling about things. And so the sun doesn't describe that. The sun only describes what your basic appearance is in the eyes of other people when you're just doing stuff. And it's not even how you talk to them. Venus is how you talk to them one-on-one. The sun is how you interact with them one-on-one. If you want to look at a person's feelings, you need to look at the moon. The moon talks about wants, and it's your intuition for things, it's your gut feeling. And so you would look at where the moon falls in an astrology chart in order to get an idea of how a person feels. So for example, if you are somebody who is very body-centric and likes to be comfortable, or likes the trappings of wealth, or things like that, you know, good food, good friends, then that typically describes a moon in Taurus. If you're more aloof and you're more sociable in terms of broad information, then maybe you'll have a moon in Aquarius. And this is how you feel about things. You can have your sun in Leo, and you can have your moon in Aquarius, and that combination is going to tell you about your personality. Now, I'm not going to dwell as long on the rest of these planets as I have on these two, but the sun and the moon are really, really important in the astrology chart. And if you only know your sun sign, you really don't know much. Okay, so moving on, you've got Mercury. Mercury in traditional astrology is associated with the intellect, and it kind of is, but it kind of isn't. When you actually do the statistics on it, you find that Mercury is less about the kind of intellect that is talked out to people, and it's more about common ground and analysis. Mercury is what you do in your head in order to make two ideas fit together. And that's probably the best description I have for it. This is borne out repeatedly when you just study hundreds of charts. And yeah, it's pretty clear that although Mercury has a lot to do with your success and your mobility in the world, it's mainly because it describes your problem solving. But it doesn't describe what you say about your problem solving. So if we don't have a thing like Venus, which actually communicates it, your Mercury meaning making would stay in your head. Venus is one-to-one communication. It's how you talk to people. So for example, you can have a person whose sun is in Sagittarius. Let's say they're kind of boisterous, and when they're showing their ego, they like to declare, well, not like to, but by default, they declare a kind of public image whenever they do their ego. So yeah, suns in Sagittarius tend to be more out there than other signs by comparison. But if their Venus is also in Sagittarius, then it will show that in their one-to-one communication, they're just as out there. But what if their Venus is in, say, Scorpio? They'll tend to be much smoother, and they'll prefer things like dirty conversations or dirty things. And that's what Venus in Scorpio helps you do. because it confers a kind of sensuality. Mars is your influence over other people. And so whenever you want to get people to do things in your favor, then you're going to be using your Mars. Again, this is different from your sun sign. Your sun is just, hey, look at me, this is how I am. But Mars is, all right, I want you to get stuff done. And I'm going to either force you to do it, or I'm going to convince you to do it, or whatever, something like that. And that's what Mars is. It's influence, it's steering. Then we move on to Jupiter. Jupiter is your public image. It's basically broadcast to the world. And really, the next four the next four planets here, are all about what you declare in the faceless world. And so when you're walking around in foreign countries, or you're among strangers, or you're in a shopping mall, and people see you, but they're not interacting with you directly, that's the purview of these four. By the way, just to kind of clear something up, when you get to the signs, well, when we get to the signs in another recording, we'll see that the astro wheel is divided into 12 sections, and the first four are about you internally. The second four, which would be the Sun, Mercury, Venus, and Mars, are about your interaction with others, like in front of you. And the last four are about your interaction with the world. Jupiter, you project your image. With Saturn, you project structure, or you have it projected on you. This is limits and boundaries and boxes that the world puts you in. So the labels that people assign to you, got that cat in the back making noise. Anyway, the label that people assign to you is represented by Saturn, and that is why it's associated with the father and the career and other things that kind of box you in and define you for the rest of the world. Uranus is about mass information. Anything that has to do with a lot of data floating around you will be described by Uranus. Neptune is your mood in the environment. The sign that Neptune is in basically tells you where you leave your strongest vibe on people. So, a person walks into a room and you're like, I don't know about them. They're kind of weird. Basically, you're looking at their Neptune. It's an emotional, what we would call it is your socio-emotional context, or something like that. It's your vibe, more or less. Pluto is social pressure. This is the set of social standards that tend to dog you throughout your life. Pluto is really slow moving, and so this tends to describe generations. It takes about 240 something years for Pluto to make it all the way around the astro wheel. So when you divide that by 12, you get Pluto sitting in a sign for something like 20 years. And so 20 years worth of people will all have Pluto in the same sign. So my generation, for example, has Pluto in Libra. And that means that those of us who are in their 30s at the time of this recording, at least, or people who were born around Gen X, that kind of thing, will have social pressure which really, really emphasizes communication. Younger groups like millennials will have Pluto in Scorpio, and they are socially pressured to be sexy and to be powerful, and so on and so forth. Okay, so these are the basic planets that you see. Now, there are other planets, and again, they're not really planets, they're astrological points in some cases. You've got the Ascendant. This is the rising sign. And so if you've ever heard of somebody's rising sign, your Ascendant is the point on the eastern horizon, and it shows how you approach new situations. So if you are going to go out into some territory or some job that you've never been at, or you're going to do some task that is not really comfortable or familiar to you, then you're using your Ascendant. Let me go ahead and skip down to the Descendant, because the Descendant is the opposite of this. This is the western horizon. You can also think of the Descendant as being the anti-Ascendant. Basically, this is how you personally respond to having gone out into those new situations. The Descendant, I just found out in the publication of the third book while I was doing the stats on it, is actually more powerful than the Ascendant. And it's kind of strange. If it is more powerful than the Ascendant, why don't we know that? I'll get to it later. The Midheaven is your reputation, your public label. It's not quite associated with your career, but it is associated with how people label you. And so if you did things that lined up with your midheaven, you'd find that your career was a little bit more obvious to everyone else. Your vertex basically describes major events. It is the major events as you experience them. This is a mathematical point, which is basically the intersection of the ecliptic with the prime vertical. And what is that? Well, the houses are basically divide the sky up in one way, and the spin of the planets divide up the sky in another way, and the kind of tracks that the spin of the planets and the houses intersect on is the vertex, and that's on the western horizon. So it's kind of technical, but it turns out to be important when you read it. Then you've got Selene. Selene is probably one of the most made up points in a chart, mainly because it moves around in a perfect circle. It is designed to take 7 years to go around the astrology chart, and for whatever reason, it strongly shows where you are really, really talented. So Selene is your blessed talent. Starting around here, I'm kind of mystified as to why some of these later planets and asteroids do what they do. I originally started studying Selene mainly because it actually seemed to do something. There are lots of asteroids out there. Some of them are of almost no account when you look at them statistically, but Selene actually does something. It's featured in a whole bunch of really extreme behaviors, for better or worse. Lilith is contrariety and rebellion. If you want to see where you are a rebel, where you do things in the opposite way, then you look at Lilith. For example, if your Lilith is in Virgo, you'll tend to do Virgo things in a Pisces way. And Pisces is opposite Virgo as a sign. Lilith works that way. It's just where you do things against the status quo. North Node feels like destiny, but really, North Node is just the place where you are at your emotional optimum. It has to do with the moon's orbit around the sun as a focal point, and basically, you can think of the North Node as being that point in the moon's path around the sun where the moon feels most right. And so you'll have your astrology chart, and your sun will be somewhere, and your moon will be somewhere, but your node basically says that, man, if the moon were here, then all would feel right with the world with you. And that kind of feeling is like destiny, because when you are acting on your North Node, you are basically doing a thing from which you really wouldn't want to turn back. Now, speaking of being in your element, the part of fortune, I'm not sure why my mouse keeps disappearing, it's kind of odd, but the part of fortune tells where you are comfortable doing whatever you're doing. You're in your you're in your element. I found that when other people's charts put planets on your part of fortune, you tend to be really attached to that side of them, and often, in most normal cases, you tend to really like that side of them because it brings out where you are just really comfortable behaving yourself. Part of the reason for that is because the part of fortune is a mathematical point calculated using the ascendant, the sun, and the moon. Basically, we take the angle between the sun and the moon and we subtract it from the ascendant. The sun and moon together give you a quality called self-contentment, and I may talk about that in a later video, but the point is that the part of fortune represents a kind of copy-pasting of your self-contentment onto your approach for things, hence being in your element as you approach things. Ceres is the dwarf planet of, I'll call it, care bullying. On the one hand, Ceres is about caretaking, but on the other hand, Ceres is, well, you tend to be a bully when you're expressing your Ceres, and it's just like, look, I am the smothery mother or something like that, and I want you to do things my way. Chiron is about, apparently, counseling. Anyway, counseling and insecurity. Wherever Chiron goes, you've got a therapy context. Again, this probably has to do with orbits, but I don't really know what it is about Chiron's orbit, which is tied, by the way, to the orbits of Saturn and Uranus, that makes it specifically have to deal with counseling. Chiron is not a planet. It is not an asteroid. It's technically a centaur, and that's basically a minor planet whose orbit is around the outer planets. It's a centaur, but we're thinking that maybe it's a comet at this point as well, and that has to do with its classification. But anyway, if you want to see somebody's point of insecurity, or a point where they feel like a therapist is in order, whether they are the therapist or someone else is the therapist, then you look at their Chiron. I would tell you that you may want to read your chart with all of these majors, but if you absolutely must include some of these non-major things, you should really include Chiron and Ceres. They're pretty important. Because if you read a chart without Chiron, then you're missing a really big chunk of what that person is about. Vesta is basically focused attention. There's not much more to say about that, but Vesta tends to be pretty informative when you want to talk about long-term things, stuff that you really dedicate your attention to. Among these would be your career and money making and your family. So Vesta itself, when I first studied it, I learned that it was about the hearth, the home, the family, and focus. It's mostly focus. All that other stuff are things that you focus on. But Vesta, much like Mercury, tends to have its meaning muddled with other stuff. Pallas is social actions, but more specifically, it's social actions aimed at reconciling an imbalance. Pallas is pretty difficult to interpret because it shows up in all kinds of I'm not going to stand for this anymore type things. But it's hard to read. It's hard to read because the I'm not going to stand for this anymore style of behavior, when it's mixed with other planets, can appear in all kinds of ways. Just think of this as where a person is really insistent, and it's tied to principles as well. Juno and Hera, let's talk about those together. So when you're looking at these basic asteroids, there tend to be a family that come together. In this family of 5, Ceres, Chiron, Vesta, Pallas, and Juno, you'll often see them studied together. On one of the sites that I have in the links section, for example, Bob Marks Astrologer, these are all talked about in a group. Juno is supposed to be something like marriage, or the marriage partner. It kind of is, but this can be deceiving. I found that when I was trying to study Juno a couple of years ago, that it really didn't tell me about marriage so much as it told me about public commitment, promises you make in the eyes of others, and basically what the world expects you to be tied to. Juno's not really marriage as in you put your heart and soul into it. It's more like, here's the marriage contract, I now pronounce you man and wife, and everybody knows it. Juno is public commitment, and the things that you attach to under Juno are basically called commitment objects. And then there's Hera. So if you're looking for the love and the romance and the whole coming together and the bonding thing, you really won't find it in Juno. So I did some searching around for some asteroids, a lot of the love asteroids and all of that, and I came to Hera. Hera talks about deep bonds. It escapes me right now where Hera is in its orbit. I forget. It is an asteroid. It might just be a standard belt asteroid between Mars and Jupiter. Don't quote me on that. But whatever the case, its orbit ties it to the notion of deep bonds. When you really want to know about the kinds of people or the kinds of situations you connect to strongly, then you look at Hera. Okay, then there's Eros. So in Full Spectrum Astrology, my first book of the trio, I talk about how, well, as long as we're looking at marriage and we're looking at bonding, why don't we look at some lust asteroids? We've got love asteroids here. Well, Hera's a love asteroid, at least. Juno pretends to be one, says it is, in front of everybody else. Let's look at lust asteroids. So I wanted to know what Eros did. Now, there are all kinds of love asteroids, and I found this list which mentioned things like Makemake and Penelope, and there's even an asteroid out there called Lust. But again, if you do some stats on this, you find that those asteroids they kind of mix their effects, and they're kind of weak compared to some of the majors and the other things that are in this table. Eros is not weak. Eros is very, very strong. Now, the interesting thing about lust asteroids is that most people aren't in a state of lust all day. And so what I wanted to know when studying the lust asteroids is, how do they look when a person is not being lusty? Well, Eros is basically passionate action. it does tell you what turns you on. No joke. Eros is pretty serious. It is an Amor asteroid. I think it's also classified as a near-Earth asteroid. So it's not between Mars and Jupiter like a lot of the ones that we look at. Instead, it's around Venus and Mars in its orbit, and it passes by Earth. Well, this is passionate action, and where you find Eros in your chart, you're looking at where a person is passionate. And then you've got Bacchus. Bacchus is kind of funny because this is one that I studied as the asteroid of orgies and group sex. And I said, okay, that's kind of cool. Is that something that is a thing in most folks' charts? No, it isn't. But now, if you table the kind of, I guess, more illicit interpretation of that, and you think about what orgies have in common with regular life, you see that it's basically the gathering of friends for pleasure. And this is more in line with the traditional interpretation of Bacchus. But doing the stats on Bacchus makes it really, really important. Now I'm going to go ahead and argue that you should include Bacchus with your interpretation of the majors as well. Like if you're going to do your astrology chart, and if you're going to display your astrology chart and you need to choose a bunch of other asteroids to put in there besides these majors, you really should add Bacchus just like Chiron. Why is Bacchus so important? Because Bacchus is the only one of the asteroids in all of these that tells you about your friends. Now, these are your true friends. These are the ones who are associated with you as friends. They're your cliques. These are the people who, basically, they're your posse. They back you up wherever you go. And when people stop fitting the description of Bacchus, then they're no longer friends. Interestingly, those of us who study Uranus as the group, like the mass information around you, you would think that Uranus talked about your friends. Or maybe Venus talked about your friends. No, Bacchus talks about your friends. Venus talks about how you communicate with people in a friendly way. Uranus talks about the group of people around you, but those of us who have jobs know that the group of people around you are not always your friends. They're just people around you who pass information. If you're looking for people whose information and whose way of being actually supports you, then you're looking at Bacchus. It's a great indication of where you can have where you can have backup in your doings. That gets us into an interesting side discussion on the Confucian rectification of names. Confucius basically says that you can find some meaning in a name. Bacchus, back us, back us. There's a little bit of a thing there. Okay, now we get into this last group of 10. In my first two books, I really limited my description of the asteroids to these first 25. In the third book, I talk about Chariklo, Intreramnia, and all these other ones, and I call these the strike-back asteroids. Unlike these top 25 here, which basically describe how you are and how your world is, these last 10, well actually these last 8, with the exception of Hidalgo and Orius, basically describe how you can make the world move according to your will. Chariklo is very, very impressive. You've got Chariklo and you've got Chiron. They're around the same area in terms of orbit, except that Chariklo's orbit is much more stable. When you do the stats on it, it is straight up ambition. It's pretty undeniable. You find Chariklo in your chart, and it tells the kinds of things that you pursue ambitiously, and it also tells the area where you make the world bow to your will. You find that when you're looking at an astrology chart, Pluto tends to pressure you. Wherever Pluto is, the world is trying to tell you what to do. Where Chariklo is, you're trying to tell the world what to do for you. Hence the definition of a strike-back asteroid. Very interesting for those of us who are trying to accomplish great things in the world. Then there's Intreramnia. I bet you've never heard of it. Lots of people have never heard of it. I hadn't heard of it. Asteroid number 704. Pretty cool. Pretty cool. I suggest that you go to Wikipedia and look at a little bit of its story, along with the story of Hidalgo, and you'll find some interesting stuff about it. But when you study Intreramnia, it basically shows where you're greedy. Now, again, much like Bacchus, you don't always have time to do what this asteroid says it does. So really, when you're looking at Intreramnia, you're not looking at where you're greedy per se, but it's where you chase things greedily, even if you're the most generous person in the world. Now, we've got the Imum Coeli. The Imum Coeli is the lower part of the sky, the bottom of the sky, and it's opposite the midheaven. If the midheaven is your reputation and your public label, then the Imum Coeli are basically the aims that you display privately, your subconscious actions, your kind of home state, which gets projected into that reputation. This is exposed aims. These are the aims that you have that inevitably get brought out in the world. So I've run into a few people over the years, and I've had this really close connection to them. It's like a kind of psychic connection, if you believe in psychicism. If you don't, whatever. But the point is that contacts to your Imum Coeli, that is, when another person has planets on your Imum Coeli, you tend to draw that out of them. So that's really, really interesting. It's something called synastry, and that's when you're comparing two charts together. Imum Coeli is really strong. It's really, really strong, as is the Descendant. The Descendant is your encounter response. As I said earlier, it is opposite the Ascendant, and so when you're approaching a new situation, you have a style of approach, but you also have this thing that you do personally as you approach it. So it turns out that the IC and the DSC are stronger than the ASC and the MC. Now earlier I mentioned that you wonder why, if the IC and the DSC are so strong, we never read about them in standard astrology. The reason we never read about them is because in order to see a person's Imum Coeli, or study it, or see their Descendant and study it, you have to know them. And most of the time, when we're looking at astrology, we're looking at the charts of famous dead people. We don't know them. We only know how they appeared to approach. We only know what their labels were said to be. But we don't know them personally. We don't know their aims, and we don't know how they felt or reacted to things. But if you study people close to you, and you study the way they actually are on a daily basis and the things they want, you'll find that the IC and the DSC describes them for the 95% of the day when they are not in the public eye. Or I should say the 95% of their lives when they're not in the public eye. These things are really, really strong, and I encourage you to take a look at it. We've got Eris. Eris and Sedna are brand new to us as far as astrology goes, and so I was curious in the latest round of research to figure out what they did. Eris is really slow. It's beyond Pluto. It takes something like 558 years to cycle the sun. And so what's it doing? Basically, Eris, where it appears in your chart, describes self-validation. It's where you are validated. Most of us have Eris around mid to late Aries. Most of us who are alive right now, because Eris is so slow, have Eris in Aries. That means we're validated on the basis of what we accomplish, what we're able to spontaneously do in the world. If you go back, I don't know, I'm not doing the division, but if you go back something like, I don't want to even guess, but a few decades, Eris will have been in Pisces. And so people will have gotten their validation more based on spirituality or their contribution to a bigger mood. As time goes on, Eris will start to sit in Taurus for longer, and those people will age, and you'll see that people will be more validated on the basis of how they feel about themselves, their bodily identities, their race, their comfort. But this is where we feel like the world says, yeah, you're okay. Sedna is about the bodily presence, or the bodily, or the salience of your presence. It's where you stand out. Sedna is very Leo-like, I guess. It's also very Taurus and Gemini-like. It's all about the spotlight, and it has a lot to do with your body. Now, I remember reading that Sedna was tied to financial crises. It may be. I didn't study that, so I don't know. But if Sedna is tied to something like financial crises, it's because Sedna has this kind of spotlight association with things in the world, and things in the world are often economic. But when I was studying Sedna, there was nothing inherently economic about it. It was really all about the standout qualities of whatever's chart it appeared in. These last four can be a little bit weird, so let me get to Varuna. Varuna is, I guess, a minor planet which gives viewable form to things. This is a little bit complicated to explain, but basically where you have stuff on Varuna, move that mouse, that stuff is more apparently visible to other people. I guess that's the best way to describe it. So for example, if you've got a Sun Varuna conjunct, it tends to give more viewable form to the way you interact with people. If you've got a Moon Varuna conjunct means they're right next to each other, then it gives more viewable form to your emotions, and you have a harder time hiding your emotions, or you have more things around you, more objects, more friends, more events, which solidly reflect your emotions. If you want to learn how to give material form to things in your life that are just in your head, then you need to take a look at Varuna. If you read all this chart without Varuna, then a lot of it remains in the world of theory. Quaoar is by far the weirdest body of all of these here. Very, very strange. I guess I'll describe it as the inner fire. It has to do with creativity. The way Quaoar works is wherever it is in your chart, it displays this characteristic that people know is there, but they don't know how it got there. They don't know really what, they never saw you build it up. All they know is that you went into a back room and then you came out and you were different. And that's basically how Quaoar behaves. It's pretty fascinating, and if you want to know where you are mysteriously creative and mysteriously powerful to other people, take a look at it in your chart. Since I like studying ambition, I end by talking about Hidalgo and Orius. Hidalgo shows where you get attention, where people look at you, and unlike Sedna, which is more where your body or your bodily presence stands out, Hidalgo is more where you're under the spotlight. That's probably the best way to describe it, I think. Planets which are right next to or in certain angles to Hidalgo tend to be susceptible to the spotlight in your chart. So if you want to be rich and famous, then one of the things you might look at is Hidalgo. I was studying, for example, lottery winnings and people who won the lottery, and there is an interesting connection between Hidalgo and the sun. But there's a catch to that. That connection between Hidalgo and the sun has to be both ways, between the individual who wins and the actual day, the date of winning. So bummer for those of us who thought we could just use Hidalgo to win the lottery. Lastly, there is Orius. Orius more or less shows where you are sophisticated or you like sophisticated things, and it can be described as where you're more of a socialite. So yeah, there's you're going out there and you're putting on the I'm cool, I'm hip, I've got high status type behavior. That's what Orius is about. And there you have it. Planets for your use in your astrology chart. I should mention that these numbers, by the way, are minor planet numbers, and they you can use them to look up your planets here. If you want more information on this stuff, then you can go to serenu.com, and it'll spit out a whole bunch of these extra asteroids in addition to the classical planets. I'll have that at the end of this series here on the slide with links.